Niamh, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for the invite, Rob. Delighted to be here with you.
Oh, no, thank you so much for taking the time out to, come on the podcast. You've been top of the list for quite some while, if I'm brutally
Such
honest
a flatterer.
with you.
I bet you say that to all the guests.
Yeah, pretty much. But no, seriously, you have been near the top, let's say, kind of joint with lots of other people to get you on, because I think your expertise, and I think this term does get banded about quite a lot, but harm reduction hero, I think, is next to your name quite a lot, so
that's really kind. There's lots of heroes in this field.
Absolutely, yeah. So Niamh, so you work at Release, so are you able to very briefly just talk to us about Release and the work that you guys do?
Yeah, of course. So Release is a charity. We were established in 1967, so we're more than 50 years old. We're thought to be one of the oldest drug policy charities in the world. We provide services as well as campaign for reforms. So we provide legal services in the community to people who use drugs, particularly people who have experience of drug dependency, addressing a range of legal issues from homelessness, housing insecurity, debt, welfare issues, so issues around benefits. We also provide a national helpline, providing people with support around criminal law. We provide drug advocacy, so we support people in treatment settings who aren't getting the treatment that they want and that they are entitled to. And we also campaign for reform of the drug laws. So we do a lot of policy work as well, mainly focusing on solutions that we think are needed in order to address some of the harms that we see because of current drug policies, but also responding to policies that impact on our clients. So that can be everything from changes to drugs legislation to reforms of housing legislation, welfare benefits legislation. So really a wide gamut of policy areas that we focus in, recognizing that people are more than just people who use drugs. They are people who face a range of issues, particularly those who are accessing the services like at Release and barod, people who are living in deprivation, who are affected by really poor social and economic policies. So I think that was probably longer than a quick explanation, but yeah, that's some of the work that we do.
Our personal interest, is there any particular campaigning on behalf of people that you would say you do most of? Is there anything that takes the majority of your time?
Oh, that's a great question. Actually, I don't think so. I think it's, it really, in terms of the reactive work, so that's the work that really responds to government consultations, government reforms, policies that are led by organizations that are involved in the lives of the people that we work with. I think that can take up a lot of the work, and it depends. So if you had talked to me in 2016 when it was the psychoactive substances bill that was before Parliament, I would say to you that was taking up most of our time then. At the minute, it's the criminal justice bill, and so the criminalisation of people who are homeless. So we're doing some work around that with Crisis. We're also concerned about the proposals to expand drug testing on arrest to all substances, not just heroin, crack, cocaine, and cannabis. So yeah, those are some of the things that we're working on. In terms of the proactive work, I think very much what we're known for is our research around decriminalisation, so ending criminal sanctions for possession of drugs. And then also the work that we've done to highlight the harms of the drug laws in particular communities in the UK, specifically the Black community and those who are living in deprivation. So I think that's kind of where our real focus is.
And I think we'll come on to some of those specifically, especially around decriminalisation. With that, but I kind of wanted to get an update really in terms of what's going on with the safe hubs, the harm reduction hubs you guys fundraised for, and I think you exceeded what you expected to kind of fundraise. So what's going on with these hubs and where are you at?
Well, it's only one hub. We've started small. And firstly, thank you to everybody who supported it. So we launched a fundraiser in January, and with our target, I think, was £7,000. And within a week, we had hit that target and gone beyond it. So at the moment, the hub is due to open, hopefully, on the 22nd of April. It is a space in our offices which are located in Aldgate in London. So we have got quite a large unhoused population locally, so folks who are street homeless. And so we've taken a space within the office, we've refurbished it, made it a really cozy, warm space where people will be able to come and hang out and charge their phones, get some legal advice, harm reduction advice. We'll be giving out testing strips. So we're going to be giving out the fentanyl testing, nitazene testing, and psilocybin testing strips. They'll be given out for free to people. We'll also be able to sell at cost reagent tests, so that folks who want to check their, MDMA, ketamine, other substances like that can come in and get that at cost price. So a big thank you to the reagent test kits guys for providing that. And yeah, we just really want to kind of create a safe space for people to come into and get support where they need it, and where they want it. And I think we're starting small. It's the first time we've done it. Our work traditionally has been outreach work, so we've gone out into communities, whereas this is someone coming into release into our building. So I think that's kind of new for us. So we're starting small like that. We hope to be able to give out naloxone, but the laws don't particularly allow us to do that right at the minute. So we're working on some partnership agreements to see if we can do that. And who knows where it goes? Who knows where the hub goes? What I will say is it is the brainchild of Sheila Sloshenberg, who is our brilliant drugs team coordinator. And it was supported with a huge enthusiasm by the team, but in particular Andre, who is our comms person. So they have been the real two heroes leading this within the organisation. But we're really excited. We open on the 22nd. I'm doing the first shift. I will be doing Monday afternoons. Everybody is pitching in. So yeah, that's where we're at.
That's awesome. Is there a gap then in terms of that sort of provision where you are?
I think it's less a gap. It's more that, I'm happy to go into this in more detail. I think some drug treatment centres are very attuned to supporting people in a way that focuses on what their immediate needs are. So like drop-ins, that type of thing. Whereas I think some centres are much more structured, and where you have those very structured centres, it's more difficult for people to engage. So when they're expected to be engaging with treatment, where they're expected to be attending appointments. So I think that kind of space isn't one that's very typical in the kind of drug treatment landscape at the minute. It used to be. I used to run legal services out of drop-ins across London. But I think more and more in recent years, with the cuts to drug treatment, but also the kind of overarching policy framework that focused on recovery as defined by abstinence, it really kind of made the environment one that is sometimes less welcoming to folks who really just don't want to engage with structured processes. Yeah. So this is very much just a chill out spot for people to come in and get advice if they want it, but also just to hang for a few hours on the sofa and drink tea or coffee.
That's awesome. Well, good luck on the 22nd, and good luck for your first shift.
Thank you. You'll have to come and see it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm gutted I missed your party a few weeks ago. That looked a lot of fun when I saw some of the content on social media. So yeah, we'll have to get a little trip from South Wales down to London.
Absolutely. We'll be having another, so this is like, for anyone who doesn't know, we did another fundraiser for the hub in partnership with the sex work movement. So with Swarm, who are an amazing sex workers movement organisation in East London, and we raised another 3,000 at that party, which will be split for a cross release and the sex work Swarm. So that was really exciting, and it was a really great night. So yes, we're going to do it again in the summer, so you'll have to come.
Absolutely, I'll get it in my calendar without a doubt. Niamh, when I was trying to think of, what could I chat to Niamh about? I don't know. I literally probably thought about 20 different questions on 20 different topics, because I know in terms of you're a fountain of knowledge, really, in terms of especially just within the drug policy field, and I'm sure much broader than that. But obviously, come just before Christmas, the drug related death figures came out, and obviously they're for England and Wales. Scotland obviously has their separate processes around the data collection, and obviously they're reported separately. But yeah, the data showed that just under 5,000 people unfortunately lost their lives in England and Wales. It's the highest on record. Again, it seems to be a continuing theme. And I was looking in terms of actually where those numbers were at even just 10 years ago, and it was less than 3,000.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I kind of wanted to get your perspective on is how we got to this situation. How are we now at a place where drug-related deaths, it seems year on year out, we're reporting that they are the highest on record, and we have a feeling that we're going to be saying the same rhetoric next year. So how have we got to this point?
That's a great question, and you're right. I mean, it is year on year for the last 10 years. So I think, firstly is the political environment that we've been experiencing for the last decade under the Conservatives. We have seen a significant disinvestment in drug treatment. That's one element. But I would say more broadly in social support systems, more across the spectrum. So it's not just what we've seen in terms of services being disinvested or defunded. It's also in relation to things like housing benefit and income benefits being cut. And those wraparound services, whether it's mental health services or youth services, also being significantly cut. So I think cuts are one of the themes that I would say have influenced the increasing rates of drug-related deaths that we've seen. So we know that drug treatment was cut by 26% over the first 7 years, I think, of austerity, and that had a significant impact on the sector to be able to support people. I think that's one part. I think the other part is the impact of the recovery agenda, and others who are listening, and you will remember this, and Barod was involved, or not Barod, the predecessor to Barod's, but I mean, many of us were really concerned about the focus of the coalition government at that time on recovery as the main outcome of treatment, and that may seem incongruent in a way, but when you define recovery as a drug-free existence, so as abstinence, you're then framing it within a moral framework, and people just weren't ready to come forward with that. And I think what I saw at that time, and that this would have been 2010 to 2012, was a huge cut in support for service user activities. So service user involvement, service user led initiatives. So whether that be people coming together to critique services as they were operating and try to make them better, our groups that were peer groups supporting each other, huge cuts in that. And that was then replaced with recovery champions, who were individuals who really were set up to be the face of recovery, the face of abstinence, and that anybody could be like that. So I think that political framing really did a huge disadvantage to people who use drugs. I get quite frustrated by this notion of it's all about an aging cohort of people who use drugs. These people are in their 40s and 50s. That is not a aging cohort. That's just middle age. This is not a reason why people should be dying. And so more broadly, I think, again, that's the more recent history of it. But the longer term history is that when we criminalize people who use drugs, when we treat them first and foremost as criminals, then they don't want to come forward and get support when they need it. And we know that from research. There's a really great piece of research that I keep citing these days that came out in 2021 from the Higher Education Policy Institution, which showed that nearly 1 in 5 students who described themselves in a scary situation with drugs did not seek emergency help. Now, that's students, and that's just the effects, the actual real life effect, the risk of criminalisation, policing, punishment can have on individuals. It can prevent them coming forward to get emergency help when they need it. And moreover, we know it can prevent people coming forward to get support when they are having issues with their drug use. So where their drug use has become, they have a problematic relationship with it. They can feel that stigma, that sense of being a criminal is one that makes getting that support difficult. And I mean, the other piece to it, I think it is drug treatment sometimes can be, again, sort of steeped within that history of criminalization and the history of prohibition and propaganda of prohibition, is this idea that people need to be fixed rather than just trying to provide spaces for people to be safe. And so I think, again, linked, going back to that recovery agenda, that idea of harm reduction being something that for a period of time throughout the 2010s, that was rejected in many ways by, politicians, by people who are actually involved in delivering services in the field. And I think all of those different ingredients have led to the situation that we are in. So if you like, it's the disinvestment, the defunding of not just treatment, but also wider social safety nets. It's the recovery agenda linked to the rejection of harm reduction. It's criminalisation, but it's also that drug treatment sometimes, and there are some really good services, but there's also some services that are not so good, create frameworks that make it hard for people to come forward. So for me, that's kind of the very complex reason why we're in the situation that we're in, and it's going to get much worse.
You think it's going to just continue? Yeah.
I think that's inevitable. I think the arrival of synthetic opioids in the way that we're seeing it disrupt the market and enter the market, not just the opiate market, but also the benzos market, I think is an inevitable outcome of that is increased death. And I don't think that any of the investment that has come from the Black Review and the new drug strategy is going to fix the problems that I've described as to why we've got in the mess that we're in. I don't think we're seeing anything that structurally changes the drug treatment framework or the legal framework that people are having to operate in a way that will resolve some of the, or in a way that resolves those problems that I describe.
So would you say then, when you talk about the legal framework, would you say then actually implementing the likes of decriminalisation, because obviously you've just released a paper with Alex Stevens and Kirsty Dowse, would you say that to be then able to implement decriminalisation, that would provide the foundation ultimately to start turning the tide?
Yeah, I think it's one part of the solution to creating an environment whereby we can reduce the harms that people face, the harms of drug policy and also the harms of drugs themselves. So I think it's one part of that picture, that framework that we need to have in place in order to support people. I mean, it isn't accidental it isn't a coincidence that of the countries across Europe that have ended criminal sanctions for drugs, for possession of drugs, all of those countries have significantly lower drug-related death rates than the UK. So that is Portugal, that is Spain, Czech Republic, Germany, Italy. I mean, all of these countries have drug-related death rates that are anywhere between half to 7 or 8 times lower than the UK. And so for example, in England and Wales, I think that the drug-related death rate there is around 60 per million. Sorry, it's normally all tied in together with Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's 76 per million of the population for the UK as a whole. But I think if we look at England and Wales, that reduces down to roughly 60. Portugal has a drug-related death rate of 9 per million of the population. Czech Republic, something similar. Both of those countries decriminalized possession of drugs decades ago. So that framework definitely helps to get better outcomes for individuals across health, social, and economic indicators. There's no doubt about that. You just are treating people as human beings, not as criminals.
Yeah.
But I think there is a broader conversation that needs to be had around drug treatment itself, and thinking about how we make sure that we are providing a system that is a low threshold access so that people can get same day prescribing, that we don't punish people for using on top. So often through our drugs advocacy service, what we see is when people disclose honestly that they have used on top of their scripts, or they have come back with a positive test for drugs or for heroin, they end up having their script reduced. Whereas in fact, the guidance says you need to increase the methadone prescribing in those circumstances to make sure that someone feels secure on their script. So I think things like that, making sure that we go back to having service user involvement, that you have service user groups that help inform the design, the delivery, the implementation of drug treatment, that we make sure that drug treatment starts to open beyond 9 to 5, that we have weekend services, we have evening services, we have services that support women with children. The idea kids can come into services is crazy to me. I was in a methadone clinic in Morocco. They had a kids' playground and someone to look after the kids whilst mom went and met with her clinician. We create such a sense of risk in the environment so often, rather than in the sense of inclusion. Now, I keep saying this, there are really great services out there. So this is not me tarnishing the whole of the drug treatment system in this way. Barod is an excellent service, but it's too often we see, to get into the drug treatment service, you have to buzz a buzzer. There's CCTV at the door. There's all of these different things that make it really difficult to engage. I think I said to someone a couple of weeks ago, sometimes it's easier for people to maintain their heroin use than it is for them to engage in treatment. And that should never be the way it is.
Do you know, in terms of you mentioned obviously with regards to different countries, Portugal, Czech Republic, I'm right in saying that they've never thought that they want to go back to the old system?
That's right. That's absolutely right. So, Portugal, for example, and so I'm going to frame it in the context of some of the developments in the US. So in Oregon, you might be aware, Rob, and others may know that Oregon decriminalized possession of all drugs in 2020. So that was the first time a US state had ever ended all criminal sanctions for all scheduled drugs. And such a brilliant piece of legislation. So it came through a ballot initiative, which is basically like a referendum, and folks voted for this initiative, which would end in criminalization of possession, but also they took a huge amount of the tax that was coming in from the cannabis market. So Oregon had legalized cannabis back in 2016. And I think at that time they expected the income to be, check me on this, but I think the income was meant to be 40-50 million. In the end, it was about 200 million in taxes. So there was this almost $150 million a year that was not designated for anything. And so through the 2020 ballot initiative, they said, we'll use this money to invest in housing, treatment, wider health interventions. And so it was actually being used to create a social safety net, which, as you know, in the US so often is missing. But at that time, pandemic hit, homelessness, as we know across the world, has gone nuts in the last 4 years. I don't know what it's like in Wales, but in London, it just seems to be increasing all the time. And so the backdrop of this was high levels of homelessness in Oregon by 2023. Lots of public drug use, because if you haven't got somewhere private to use, you're going to use publicly, and therefore a backlash against decriminalisation in the Oregon context. And what we saw was, as part of this backlash, was critiques of Portugal in particular. So the New York Times and Washington Post describing Portugal as a failed experiment, that Portuguese politicians now rejected the decriminalisation model that had been implemented since 2001. Where in fact, at the same time these articles were coming out in the US press, the Portuguese government and the Portuguese parliament were legislating to add fentanyl to the list of substances that were decriminalised, and were abolishing thresholds in recognition that thresholds, so that's the quantity of drugs which were determined. If you were caught in a certain quantity, then below that threshold, it was decriminalised. Above that threshold, it was a criminal offence. And they got rid of the thresholds because they recognised that for many people who use drugs, being caught above the threshold meant that they were still being treated as criminals, despite the fact that they were using for their own personal use. So, this was contrary to the developments, or the way that the situation was being described in the US. So yeah, not only is there been no change, there's been advances in the policy. So they've moved forward with the policy. So they've recognized the risk, for example, of synthetic opioids. And whereas in the US, you see conversations of, well, we need to prosecute drug suppliers for manslaughter or murder when they supply fentanyl. In Portugal, they're recognizing that actually we get better outcomes from our health system when we don't treat people as criminals. So they're going forward with that policy. Similarly, in the Czech Republic, they're also looking at how they can be even more progressive in their approach to drugs.
Do you feel, though, in terms of what's happening in Oregon, that maybe that may set a little bit of a precedent for others to kind of go back? Is there a fear there, do you think?
That's a really good question. I think it's a particular North American experience at the minute. So Canada, BC, British Columbia decriminalised possession of all drugs last year. They got a federal exemption from having to implement the federal law of possession offences. I think what we're seeing in North America, and again, you've probably seen it on social media, etc., is these attacks on not just Oregon, but BC, in San Francisco, in places like that, where progressive policies are associated with high levels of drug use, high levels of homelessness, and high levels of harm. Whereas actually, the reality is that those harms are happening regardless of progressive approaches or not. So, for example, in San Francisco, they had a mayor and a district attorney, the district attorney who had decided not to bring prosecutions against people who were caught in possession of drugs in recognition of the overdose crisis that's occurring in the US. And it is a crisis. There's 100,000 people died last year in the US alone of overdoses. And so as part of this, trying to find solutions to that problem, some mayors, or some DAs, I keep saying mayor, but DAs come in, district attorneys keep coming in and saying, we won't prosecute these offences. This is creating more harm than good. Then you get the backlash, and the backlash is linked with this visible drug use. But I would say that is a housing crisis rather than a linked to the drug use itself. Now, there's a toxic drug supply in the US, so that is a crisis, but it is a homelessness crisis that is causing the visibility of drug use. But rather than trying to address that, it's easier to blame these progressive policies. So that backlash, I think, is very much contained within the North American context at the minute. I think there are risks of it seeping into Europe. We see that there are certainly influence from actors who are involved in the North American piece in the UK piece and in Scotland particularly. So I think there are concerns that we have around this kind of backlash to harm reduction and backlash to decriminalisation more broadly. And I think it's incumbent on us in the field to really get our arguments in order around how important harm reduction is to protect lives and keep people safe, but also in making sure that we highlight where the harms that people are witnessing are structural harms linked to lack of investment in communities, linked to housing crises that are a result of a market system that doesn't benefit people who don't have resources. You know, we really need to start to talk about those policies, those social and economic policies that create more harm for the people that we work with and for. So I think it's really important that for a long time, many of us in the field have kind of stayed in our lane around drugs and harm reduction, but actually it's really important that we look at the intersecting political and economic policies that are creating greater harms, more visibility of drug use that are linked to increased overdose deaths, and that really it's fundamental that we start to advocate for reforms in those areas as well that really underpin people's rights and improves their health.
Like you said, there's so many different things connected to it, and even, you know, you'll be aware more than others as well, you know, a little bit outside of what you were saying, how drug policy is interlinked with climate change as well, you know, and that's, you know, for me, I've become more aware of that probably in the last couple of years as well. So, you know, so even kind of moving outside of just specific individuals, just the world as a whole and our climate, and how just drug policy plays such a pivotal role in so many different societal kind of issues really with that. To bring it back home then, Niamh, so obviously, as I mentioned, the paper that you did with a couple of colleagues, so in defence of the decriminalisation of drug possession in the UK, I did have to write that down because I wouldn't have been able to remember that. You, in that paper then, so you basically put forward a modest model of decriminalisation. So what is that model that you proposed within that paper?
So rather than advocating for a new legislative approach to drugs, so having to draft legislation and advocate and argue for why that legislation is the right approach, Alex, myself, and Kirsty suggested that in the interim, what you could do is simply repeal certain sections of the Misuse of Drugs Act to ensure that possession is no longer an offence. So we put forward Section 5 of the Misuse of Drugs Act is the section that criminalises possession and possession with intent to supply. And what we suggested was that you take out the clauses within Section 5 that were focused solely on possession for personal use. So that's Section 5.1 and Section 5.2. We also suggested that you amend Section 23 of the Act to remove police powers to stop and search people who are suspected of being in possession of drugs for their own personal use. And this is in recognition, and I think all of us as authors of the paper agreed that there are two groups that are harmed by drug policy currently. There are people who are part of the drugs market, so people who use drugs, people who are suppliers as well. Often people who use drugs also supply drugs. But then there is also people who are over-policed as a result of drug policy. So we've done a lot of work highlighting how Black communities in the UK are really at the brunt of drug law enforcement, where, you know, the most recent figures are they are 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, despite using drugs at lower rate or at similar rates to the white population. So, I mean, we really want to make sure that we were taking away that policing power, as well as taking away the risk of criminalization of possession. So it was both of those things that we wanted to address, and that's why we made those suggestions.
Yeah, and one thing I really liked about the paper as well is it's kind of in the title really, that you actually defend the model from arguments from both ends of the spectrum really, in terms of, some people saying that it kind of goes too far away from the current status of drug policy, maybe going a bit too soft on drugs, and then on the other side, that it doesn't go far enough. I guess with the latter, what is the argument around maybe not going down the route of legalization? Because I know for me, when I've, previous episodes, with Mather Busby, who obviously wrote a book around, should we legalize all drugs? And ultimately one of the arguments, well, the end argument ultimately is, yeah, potentially we should. So what's the argument for maybe not going down that route?
Well, just firstly, in terms of the other side, the argument that thinks it's a soft approach, we already actually take this approach in relation to the Psychoactive Substances Act. So just to make that clear, we do have a decriminalisation framework within the 2016 Act. It's not a great act for many reasons, but we don't criminalise people who are caught in possession of substances that fall under its ambit, nor do we give police powers to search people for possession of psychoactive substances. In terms of legalization, I get quite frustrated about this idea that legalization and decriminalization are binary options within drug policy. I think it's a unhelpful analysis, really. And I think you can have legalization without decriminalization, which is problematic in itself. So if we look at Canada, for example, which regulated cannabis back in 2018, they retained the offence of possession of cannabis, where that cannabis comes from the unregulated market. Now, how police tell the difference, I don't know. But that,
I was going to ask that. Yeah, how do they know the difference?
I don't know. But ultimately, it does put at risk the people who have historically been thrown under the bus of prohibition, being thrown under a prohibition 2.0 type bus, a form of legalization that benefits people who have the resources to access that market, and who are not likely to be profiled in the way that many people are currently profiled under criminal laws. So I think legalization and decriminalization are absolutely policies that have to be advocated in tandem. It is not one or the other. I think we also need to be quite realistic about where we are in relation to some substances. So, for example, for us at Release, where we see the greatest harms are for folks who have a history of heroin, crack cocaine use, benzo use, street benzo use, where that intersects with experiences around poverty. So it's not so much about the drugs, it's about their social status. And so therefore they're over-policed around their drugs because of where they live and who they are. And so we want to think about ways of relieving the pressures that they face. And so those pressures are really relieved through talking about how do we take away those powers of policing and take away the effect or the risk of criminalization. And I would love us to have a legal market in those drugs. And I think, we do have to some degree with opiates in terms of opiate substitute therapy, although you have to use the illegal drugs to get there in the first instance. But we're very, very far away from having conversations about regulated models for those substances. And so I think in the interim, as part of the progression towards legalization, it's fundamental that we continue to have those conversations about decriminalization and promote this as a realistic, achievable policy goal that we could do now. Yeah, I think regulation is more complex, particularly with cocaine. Yeah, that's the reality. There are international treaties. It does only grow in one part of the world. it is more complex. It's less complex with the other substances. So I think there are challenges in getting to legalization, but I don't think you argue one over the other. You argue both in tandem, and you're absolutely clear that that's what you're doing as an advocate.
With that in mind, then, and obviously in terms of that model that you proposed, in reality, how optimistic / skeptical are you in terms of that ever becoming reality? With the being mindful that we've got a general election coming up at some point. So even if we do have a change of government, is there any sunshine on the horizon around this? Where do you stand? Where do you feel on that?
Well, I wouldn't do the job I do unless I was optimistic about it. I think we will inevitably get to decriminalisation. I think we will look back on the 100 years of prohibition and how we treated people and how people were harmed, and look at it with a huge amount of just incredulous that we allowed this policy to develop in the way that it has, when it's responsible for so much harm. Right now, right here, politically, Conservatives are going. Obviously, we have had not a positive insight into Labour's position. I don't think anything that Keir Starmer has said or Wes Streeting has said fills us full of hope. But I also think that, when, parties win elections, there are opportunity to bring forward more arguments to make clear why this really is an issue that Labour should care about. The fact that drug laws disproportionately impact on communities of colour, disproportionately impact on people living in poverty, that there is not an equitable application of the law, that there are people who use drugs with impunity, not least, Tory party leadership candidates and others like that. It's so, I think, easy to demonstrate the harms and also to demonstrate the futility of the policy. The fact that, the 1971 legislation was established over 50 years ago. At that time, drug use, or at least declared drug use, was in its few thousands of the population. Now we're in the millions. This is a policy that has failed on its own stated aim, whether it's the 71 Act or the 1961 Convention, or Nixon's declaration of a war on drugs in 71 as well. This has failed in its own stated aim. Drug use has grown exponentially across the globe. It continues to grow exponentially. We have UN reports year after year talking about how well production of what drug A, B, or C is doing. Last year, the cocaine section of the UN World Drug Report described the market as booming. I keep saying that report now looks more like a shareholders report than it does a critique of the drugs market globally. This is where we're at. And every year the UK government is spending anywhere north of 1.6 billion. That was the figure that the Home Office cited in 2017 on drug law enforcement. And that report, that 2017 report from the government, said that it had little to no impact on the availability of drugs. So we have this huge amount of evidence that shows the futility of the policy. And I think, I'm very struck at the moment around Alex Stevens' work on morality and values and how that plays into policy making. And I do wonder whether, and this is the thing that, my optimism is very much kind of, it places checks and balances on my optimism, is the concern that crisis actually will be one of the reasons we would see reform. So the fact that we've got the synthetic opioids, the drug-related deaths being the highest on record and likely to get worse. All of these things, I think, provides a space for a conversation about different approaches, because we cannot keep doing what we have been doing for decades and not only get the same outcome, get worse outcomes every year. I mean, that's quite astounding. And so I think that space for having an intelligent conversation with politicians, and it's going to be a whole new bunch of people in Westminster. We already have allies in Westminster. I think there's going to be real tension, and this interests me deeply, around how Scottish Labour is going to interact with Labour in Westminster. I mean, we know Scottish Labour wants much more progressive approaches to drugs in Scotland in light of the crisis that's there. How's that relationship going to work? So I'm interested in kind of how do we work across the different power bases in the UK, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, to think about, like, how do we put pressure on the centre to push for reforms? Because every year the outcomes get worse, and that is not a successful policy approach.
Yeah, because obviously we're Welsh Labour is our government, so it'd be interesting, like you said, with Scottish Labour then as well. But with Welsh Labour being in power, it'd be interesting to see in terms of any particular or further alignment really with a potential UK Labour government. Going back in terms of the current government and obviously their performance, I don't really know how to put it any other way, in terms of around drug policy for the last 14 years. I've worked in this field since November 2010, so I've only known ultimately either a coalition or a Tory government whilst I've kind of been within the substance use field. So I don't know, in terms of what Labour looked like before that. But from the outside, it seems to me that they give off this perception that they go against that evidence that you were talking about. So obviously, I think it was last year, Mather Busby, an article he released after a 3-year battle, basically published that the government had, hidden an ACMD report advising of decriminalisation, which dated back to 2016. Do you think their rhetoric of being tough on drugs has gone so far that they just can't change, or they don't want to change for losing face?
I think they're so tough on everything. I mean, it's just their mantra, isn't it? It's just another group of people who they can blame for their failed approach. I mean, I think we always have to remember that the reason, and this is my view, is that one of the reasons we have the policies that we have is there is a strategy behind it, even if we may hate the strategy. And the strategy in this instance is for the Conservatives, and Labour has done it before, so I'm not giving them a bye-ball on it, but what they do is they say to communities, the reason your community is in, the dire straits it is, and it's why the high street is closing, why there is, increased sort of antisocial behaviour within communities, and I don't like that term, and that is old Labour. But why those things happen is because people are dealing drugs. It's because county lines. It's because of migrants. So this idea of fear, and we have to also recognise fear has been a really effective political tool across the world in recent years. Fear is what's winning elections in some parts of the world, including, like in the recent years in the US. I mean, and that idea of fear is seen as a very politically powerful tool. And I think it is particularly apparent within the drugs space, like within drugs policy, when you look at things like county lines. I mean, county lines, I remember when that was first coined in the mid-10s. So we did expert witness cases at the time. And basically, we would provide testimony for the defence on the reality of the market. So, police would say, we've seized 10 plants, they're worth X. But the problem was the police would weigh the cannabis when it was wet. and with the root. So it was much heavier than when it was, dried.
Wow.
So that kind of thing. But like, this person is, I mean, so someone has a car that costs this much money. They are clearly higher up the, drug trafficking chain than the average street supplier, that kind of thing. And in 2015, we started to hear county lines on a handful of cases. By 2017, every case was county lines. And that was quite astounding to us, because when actually you looked at the characteristics of the case, it wasn't very different from cases we were getting 5 years prior. It was just drug supply. And I think there's a really great paper by an academic called Patrick Williams and two other co-authors whose names I can't remember, so I apologize to them. They're all brilliant. And it talked about how county lines has been used as a way of further racializing the idea of the drugs market and who the drug supplier is. And so again, feeds into this idea of fear and threat. And therefore, we must continue to fund law enforcement. We must continue to fund these punitive responses to deal with this fear and threat. Whereas actually, if we look at, why are young people becoming involved in the supply chain? Young people have always been involved in the supply chain. But why? Deprivation, lack of opportunities locally, closure of youth centres. These are the structural issues. But what we do is, instead of funding the structural issues, we throw money into law enforcement, and we allow for this rhetoric that says more and more money needs to be poured into this because otherwise our communities are at risk. Whereas actually the risk has been created and has historically been created, not just under the Tories, because we haven't properly looked at our economic and social policies. I mean, that's the reality of it. So I think, going back to your point about the Tories, this is not an ill thought out policy on their behalf. This is intentional. Like, whether we look at it from the discussion around the boats or we look at the discussion around county lines, it's all tied up in making communities afraid and therefore, voting for them because they'll be tough on these things. That's my very cynical view of it. And I think it's probably, I think it's actually probably reflective of what I've seen over 20 years in this field.
Sure. And I think in terms of some of those things that you said, especially around county lines and young people being involved, it goes back to what you were saying at the top of the show, in terms of that disinvestment and, lack of youth provisions and stuff like that, all, very much kind of linked in, as well as many other things, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. That. And young people have always been part of this field. Like kids in their late teens have always been part of it. And I think I also get quite angry about this idea of like the people who use drugs are victims, and we take away their autonomy when we describe them this way, and then people who supply drugs as villains who are sometimes exploiting. This is a supply and demand market, the same as any other market. I mean, the majority of people involved in these markets are involved in them through their own consent, and what we've done is we have criminalized this whole framework and made it much more dangerous and much more unnecessarily violent than, it needs to be. So, I think that's one of the problems that we've got is, like, we really need to talk about people who supply drugs. Like during the pandemic, there were lots of suppliers who were providing drugs on credit, like they were making sure people were okay. People share drugs all the time. These are acts of looking after each other. So, like, I think actually our discourse around the drugs market needs to be one that is much more realistic of markets more broadly.
Yeah, the drugs market is subject to simple economics at the end of the day, isn't it? Just like most other things. Niamh, I want to end on a couple of positives, to be honest with you. The first one, I guess, in terms of close to home, in terms of for you, is there anything that you feel is quite exciting that's happening within UK drug policy at the moment? I say that obviously in terms of, we're looking at the first potential overdose prevention centre or drug consumption room or whatever. I know Scotland uses a different terminology, which I cannot for the life of me remember what it specifically is right now. But yeah, ultimately that is going to be potentially the first one in the UK that's going to be operated in Glasgow. You know, we've obviously got community drug checking happening on a monthly basis in Bristol now, facilitated by the Loop. Is any of that, or is there any other things going on within UK drug policy that is particularly exciting for you and for the guys at Release?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely that both of those examples are exciting. It just shows that you can achieve change when, you know, people are really brave and outspoken. Like, I think the work of Fiona Measham around the Loop has been, you know, really why we're seeing the first legal, if you like, you know, authorised one opening in Bristol, and the work of Peter Crichton up in Glasgow. So yeah, I mean, I think those are really exciting things. I think, so personally, what I'm seeing is a field that's coming together much more in terms of trying to build a movement, you know, of starting to think about how we bring in different sectors and how we work across different ally movements as well. So, I mean, some of the things that I think are really interesting at the minute is kind of more support for harm reduction, more people joining networks who are identifying as networks of harm reductionists. Also, the opportunity to think about how we then take those groups and work with like sex worker movements, people who are working with the unhoused, like how we start to build allies across different social movements in order to really work to achieve structural reforms. So looking at like drug policy reform, but also some of those things I talked about earlier around economic and social reforms. So I think that's exciting as well. I also think like just local work is really exciting at the minute. I mean, we've had a couple of really, really great outcomes around challenging local policies. So one that I'll highlight is one local authority wanted to bring in a public space protection order. And that is an order that can lead to, well, basically it's a civil order, which means it's not a criminal offence, but the order can have a list of prohibitions. And if people break that prohibition, they can be fined and then they can be criminalised if they don't pay the fine. And so examples of the prohibition include not being in possession of drugs, even though that's a criminal offence in its own right, not being in possession of drug paraphernalia. So that would mean that people going to a local needle exchange to get their injecting equipment could be subject to being in breach of the order and fined, so it undermines harm reduction interventions, and also prohibiting the use of tents, so really targeting people who are street homeless. So we put in our opinion to the local authority. We presented oral evidence to the Public Safety Committee at the local authority, and they decided not to go ahead with it. And I actually think there's something really interesting about thinking, how do we create a national movement based on challenging local decisions, and how do we use the local to influence the national as well, so that by challenging those local decisions, by taking down things like public spaces protection orders, that we could actually convince governments that these are, harmful pieces of legislation and harmful powers that really just target people who are living in some of the worst circumstances. So I'm quite excited by that work as well. And also we've got all of these amazing councillors across the country who are quite progressive and are interested in engaging around these issues. So I think some of the local work is as interesting as some of the national developments.
But that's amazing news that they actually decided not to go ahead with that.
People, and that's not the only area. We've had a couple of areas where we've had those wins. And so we're working with Liberty and others to kind of think about how do we scale this up and how do we develop tools for local folks to do those challenges, because we're only a tiny organisation. But it's those kind of things that I think also are really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The last question I wanted to ask you is, obviously within the last month, obviously the UN Commission on Narcotics Drugs referenced harm reduction for the first time. I guess two questions really from that. One, how significant is that? And secondly, what impact will that have in the UK?
Both great questions. I should say I'm not an expert on the UN, and my colleagues at IDBC, the International Drug Policy Consortium, would be able to give you a much more in-depth analysis on what happened. I mean, we were at CND, but I think what is maybe a little bit more interesting than the term harm reduction being adopted by the Commission is actually the process that got it added into a document. So normally what happens at the Commission is that countries agree by consensus. So it's this really tedious situation where you'll have a number of resolutions that are presented to the Commission by whichever country every year, and it'll just be a country will sponsor it. So you can have, I think it was Kyrgyzstan last year had something about drones. And so that was a resolution. And, every year there's a resolution on Indigenous rights and alternative development. And, that's usually supported by a couple of the Latin American countries and the Netherlands. And every year the argument boils down to whether Indigenous rights stays or not. So it can get really technical with every word being negotiated. And then this kind of consensus position coming to an agreed final text. Whereas this year, what happened was America had brought forward so the US had brought forward a resolution highlighting the need to address the overdose crisis, and that's where harm reduction was. And harm reduction was in several parts of the text, including in the title of the text. The only other sponsor of the resolution was the UK, which is interesting. And that was not because other countries didn't support it. It was just the US hadn't asked anybody else at that point. I have my own theories why the UK signed up. But the normal process has happened. By the end of the last day, before it went to plenary, that resolution had not been agreed, and neither had actually the alternative development resolution, neither of them. And so it went to the plenary. And by the time the text had got to plenary, there was only one reference to harm reduction left in the text. So the harm reduction in the title had gone as well. It was in one of the operational paragraphs. But both of those resolutions, so the alternative development and the US harm reduction overdose resolution, ended up being voted on. And it was the first vote that had happened at the Commission in 50 years. And so it was seen as a breaking of the consensus that no longer, it was the first time that the normal procedures and the normal rules of engagement had actually fallen apart. And it was Russia who called the vote. So Russia called the vote when the US, when consensus couldn't be reached. So it was fascinating to watch. I actually was back in London at that time, and I watched online, and I'm quite sure that UNTV had the highest ratings that day of any Commission meeting, because everywhere, anyone who had been there just watched it to watch this whole thing kind of fall apart. So I think that's what's interesting about it, more than the harm reduction wording itself. It's more this kind of, this very archaic, very staid process has had to become more dynamic and had to respond to the fact that we now, consensus can no longer be reached. The positions are too far apart. So the position of the kind of hardcore countries of Russia, Iran, China, others are too far away from the US, the UK, Europe, and more progressive countries. Now that might change next year with the US. We don't know. But that's what was interesting here. It was this fracturing of the system. Will it have any impact on the UK? The UK were co-sponsor, so we'll be using that as part of our advocacy and reminding them that they supported this resolution right from the start when it had all of those references to harm reduction in it. So I think it is useful for us. How much the UN system influences countries like the UK, I would say, is limited. I think, though, it has huge influence on countries in the global south, who are often being supported through UN initiatives that are run by the United Nations of the Office on Drugs and Crime.
Yeah. Oh, it's fascinating stuff. And
yeah, sorry, that was a bit of a rambling one, but it's complex.
No, not. It was, yeah, no, fascinating just to kind of hear it. And you did yourself a disservice there, Niamh, saying that, you know, the guys at ID, CP would kind of.
Oh no, they would be much. I mean, they live and breathe this stuff. I mean, they've been for every year for years. So like, yeah, you should definitely speak. Dave Beauty Taylor would have good insight into it as well. So like, these are people I think you should speak to around this, because it was really fascinating. Like, there was an excitement amongst progressive civil society in this space that actually the system is broken, and I think that reflects more broadly the idea that prohibition itself is broken. It was always broken, but this is now a kind of expression of it at the international level.
Yeah. Niamh, that was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for taking the time out. It was an absolute pleasure, really.
Me.
No, anytime. And you're back in Wales in June.
I can't wait.
Yeah, so at our conference, which should be absolutely fab. So I know, you know, you've spoken at many events, many of our events over the years, and yeah, can't wait to have you back in Wales. And yeah, and good luck for the opening of your hub and your shift. And I'm very impressed that you're getting stuck in. That's cool. Fair play to you.
That's the type of organization we are.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, we took down the walls and rebuilt the walls. That was me, Sheila, Andre, and Keith at the organization did that. Don't worry, the money was spent on good things as well. We had architectures, we had painters and things, but the walls we did. But thank you so much, Rob. Honestly, it was such a pleasure to talk, and really looking forward to June, and people should come to the conference. It should be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's many other things obviously we can discuss, but yeah, Niamh, thank you very much. And yeah, we'll see you in a couple of months.
See you soon. Thanks, Rob.
If you have been affected by any of the issues discussed in today's podcast, please reach out. Barod have a free and confidential live web chat service that is available 7 days a week on our website at barod.cymru, where you can chat to a trained support worker. Alternatively, you can contact Wales's National Drug and Alcohol Helpline, Dan 24/7, either by calling 0808 808 2234 or text Dan to 81066.